Hello, friends, and welcome back to the podcast. Hola, amigos, y bienvenidos al podcast. Today's a really special episode in that it's bilingual. So the first part is going to be in Spanish, and the second part is in English. My guest is Lorenzo Gamboa. He's the Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach at Santa Clara University. And we're talking about some of the things that he believes Latinx families should know as they prepare for college. Hoy es un episodio especial porque es bilingüe. La primera parte va a ser en español y la segunda parte en inglés. Déjame terminar la introducción en inglés y ya regreso en español. So in this episode, we discuss a variety of misconceptions that families sometimes have, including the notion that students have to major in a high-paying profession or career, the myth that undocumented students can't go to college, and we talk about whether or not students should discuss race or cultural influence in their college essays and application post the Supreme Court's decision to ban affirmative action. So if you want to listen to the English part, just fast forward to basically right around the midway point of the episode where you hear me speaking in English. Quick side note that we had some tech glitches in the audio when we recorded. Sorry about that, but hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. Hola, compañeros. Mi invitado hoy es Lorenzo Gamboa, el director de diversidad, inclusión y alcance de la Universidad de Santa Clara. Estamos discutiendo algunas de las cosas que él cree que las familias deben saber mientras se preparan para la universidad. Discutimos una variedad de conceptos erróneos que las familias a veces tienen. Por ejemplo, la noción que los estudiantes deben especializarse en una profesión o carrera muy lucrativa. También hay el mito de que los estudiantes indocumentados no pueden ir a la universidad. Y discutimos si los estudiantes deben o no deben discutir la raza o la influencia cultural en su solicitud, o sea, su aplicación, sus ensayos para la universidad, después de la decisión del Corte de los Estados Unidos de prohibir la acción afirmativa. Lorenzo Gamboa es originalmente de un pueblito chiquito en el estado de Colorado, donde se recibió con solo 8 alumnos en su clase de la prepa. Basado en esta experiencia, Lorenzo conoce bien las barreras principales que asumimos con el temor de considerar opciones universitarias cuando los recursos son limitados, y tiene más de 15 años de experiencia como consejero de admisiones y se encarga de iniciativas que promueven el acceso universitario para todos. Tiene una licenciatura en Economía de la Universidad de Santa Clara, una maestría en Estudios Mexicano-Americanos y una maestría en Administración de Empresas de la Universidad de Santa Clara. Disculpa que en algunas partes el audio no salió perfecto, pero ojalá disfruten esta conversación. Bueno, primeramente, gracias por estar aquí conmigo. Quería saber, ¿cómo llegaste a la admisión a la universidad?
¿Cómo llegué a esta posición de admisiones? Pues muy interesante, porque como una persona de primera generación, esto no era algo que pensé que iba a ser mi profesión. Sin embargo, cuando llegué a la universidad, me fui a trabajar. Mi primer empleo fue como representante internacional para una empresa aquí en área de Bahía. Después de allí me fui a trabajar para una empresa de ingeniería y allí es cuando me invitaron los jesuitas donde estudié que participara en una charla aquí donde hablábamos sobre la ética de nuestra profesión y los valores personales que tenemos. Y la pregunta era, ¿cómo te sientes al final del día cuando llegas a tu hogar? Y eso me cayó como de peso, como dicen. Y ahí es donde dije, bueno, mira, me crié de primera generación en un ranchito al sur de Colorado, donde para mí la naturaleza era lo primordial. Ahora mi trabajo era de ir a los bosques, a los valles de aquí de California y como ingeniero decirles, mira, aquí es como vas a romper todo esto para poner los edificios que estamos construyendo. Y para mí, pues, claro, ganaba muy bien y muy bonito, pero al final del día, pues me sentía peor porque estaba destruyendo lo que más amaba yo, que era la madre naturaleza. Y podría ser el mejor ingeniero del mundo, pero nunca podría traerla para atrás a donde estaba ahí antes de que yo la haya destruido. So, cuando di esa conversación y esa oportunidad, me dijeron después del taller que pues que se había pensado en una profesión como consejero de admisiones. Y ahí es donde le dije, pues, ¿qué es admisiones? Y me confesaron que pues sería algo hablando así, exactamente, diciendo el testimonio de mis experiencias y tratando de abrir las oportunidades a estudiantes que como yo estábamos buscando. Y les dije, bueno, lo intentaremos. Y empecé pensando que iba a ser por unos cuantos meses y pues ya voy casi para 2 décadas aquí en esta profesión.
Wow, increíble. Cuando eras niño, ¿qué mensajes te daba su familia sobre educación?
Mis padres, pues a ellos les doy gracias por todo lo que somos. Creo que nuestros padres siempre nos inculcan que sigamos los sueños que pues, para ellos quizás no se los pudieron brindar. Y siempre me dijeron, quiero que estudies, hijo. Quiero que sigas adelante, que no te quedes estancado como yo, que, que quiero que sepas que aquí estamos para apoyarte y que por favor no dejes que se te pasen las oportunidades. So, gracias a ellos estamos aquí.
Wow. Y ahora, en su trabajo, ¿qué haces? O sea, ¿qué problemas estás trabajando para resolver?
En mi trabajo ahorita soy el director de diversidad, inclusión y involucramiento. So, mi trabajo es de que yo necesito que estar buscando estudiantes que nos traigan las oportunidades de promover todo lo que estamos haciendo y traer los estudiantes más influyentes para que sigan adelante. So, lo que hago es tratar de levantar el velo de lo que muchos presumen que es imposible y que sepan cómo acceder a esas oportunidades.
Bueno, quiero romper algunos mitos que a veces están ahí en el aire, digamos. ¿Cuáles son algunos de los conceptos erróneos comunes que cree que tienen los padres latinos?
Buena pregunta. No solamente los padres, sino también los estudiantes tienen el mismo mito, que es de que no podemos acceder a las universidades porque simplemente no tengo las calificaciones o simplemente porque pensamos que pues, no somos capaces de llegar a ese próximo nivel. Sin embargo, lo que es la realidad es lo que no entendemos, de que hay muchísimas oportunidades en este país, gracias a Dios. Ahorita, por ejemplo, existen más posibilidades, más asientos en las universidades que estudiantes que están aplicando para tomar esas oportunidades en este tiempo. La realidad es que por medio de las universidades en este país aceptan más del 70% de los estudiantes que están aplicando ahorita. Este mito de que no puedo atender porque no me van a aceptar es un mito grandísimo. Si yo les digo, por favor, apliquen. Ustedes no saben lo que estamos buscando. Simplemente ábranse las oportunidades que ustedes están buscando. Claro, si vamos todos a ir aplicando a las universidades más selectivas que todos conocemos, digamos la UCLA o Harvard o Yale, todo eso, sí se va a poner difícil. Pero si abrimos un poquito más las ideas y las oportunidades, van a ver que en este país tenemos más de 4,000 universidades. Todas estamos buscando estudiantes. Hablen con sus consejeras, con sus consejeros, o simplemente hablen con nosotros para buscar esas oportunidades.
Y ese mito de que las universidades privadas son más caras que las universidades públicas, habla de eso un poco.
Pues no es un mito, porque sí, somos muy cariñosas, pero también lo que siempre les digo a mis padres es de que no se limiten en esa realidad, porque las universidades particulares generan su propio ingreso y somos como minis empresas donde estamos buscando los estudiantes que nos más benefician como una industria, y si su hija o su hijo se ha aplicado y le ha echado ganas a los estudios, unas escuelas particulares que parecen que sí son muy, muy, muy caras, en verdad pueden ser hasta más baratas que las escuelas más públicas que existen ahí en sus áreas. Les digo a mis estudiantes, nunca se me limiten simplemente por lo que están viendo, porque ustedes no saben hasta el momento que apliquen cuánto se les va a otorgar. Échenle ganas, sigan adelante, y si de veras le echan ganas, nosotros les vamos a dar las oportunidades y abrirles las oportunidades para que atiendan las escuelas, no importa cuáles sean. Pero claro, si van y pasan, como decimos en nuestro idioma, de panzazo las clases, entonces ustedes son los que nos van a pagar a nosotros para asistir a estas escuelas.
Dijiste los estudiantes que más benefician, y me imagino que haya algunos estudiantes ahí que están preguntando, bueno, ¿qué pasa si no he tomado las pruebas estandarizadas? ¿Es posible llegar a la universidad sin tomar esas pruebas?
Sí, porque las escuelas todas estamos buscando diferentes cosas. Y por eso les digo a mis estudiantes, ustedes necesitan que hablar con los consejeros para ver qué es lo que están buscando, y luego las oportunidades se les van a abrir. No se limiten a nada. Ustedes hablen y entonces se les abren las puertas. Si no se les abren las puertas, hagan lo que dice mi madre, sigue tocando y se te abrirá una ventana.
Me crecí en comunidades latinoamericanas, Ecuador, Colombia, en España, y después viví en Miami. Y una de las cosas que pasó muchas veces, mis amigos no podían salir del estado porque sus padres decían, bueno, me vas a dejar, me vas a olvidar, todo eso. Y también cuando yo trabajaba con estudiantes, a veces los padres dicen, bueno, no quiero que vayas. ¿Qué dices a las familias que tienen ese temor que sus hijos les van a dejar o olvidar o algo así?
Es muy bonito para mí ver, porque eso me quiere decir que para ellos, como nosotros, la comunidad latina, siempre la familia es algo muy, muy importante. Pero también les digo que por favor consideren que hoy en día, honestamente, ¿quién pierde el acceso a familiar? Solamente el que quiere, porque ahorita tenemos acceso a celulares, a FaceTime, a Facebook, al chisme, como le decimos, todo eso, que ustedes van a tener acceso a todo. Claro, ¿van a poder estar sus hijos con ustedes 24 horas al día? No, porque no es posible. ¿O van a poder asistir a todas las fiestas familiares? No, porque hay otras prioridades ahorita en estos momentos. Sin embargo, un estudio que se realizó de parte del Pew Research Center encontró que el 97% de los alumnos asistiendo a las universidades en el año 2021 ya tenía acceso a un celular. Ese mito de que vamos a perder acceso familiar es un gran mito.
¿Qué mensaje tienes para los padres que piensan que sus hijos tienen que especializar en una profesión o una carrera muy lucrativa?
Especialmente en mi comunidad latina, donde pues para nosotros siempre ha sido que tienes que aplicar para ser médico, ingeniero, abogado, profesiones que te van a pagar lucrativamente muy bien. Lo que les digo a los estudiantes de hoy, a las familias de hoy, es de que por favor no se limiten solamente a esas carreras. Sin embargo, mejor enfóquense en algo que les da pasión, porque cuando se enfocan en lo que más les da la felicidad, van a ser mejor no solamente en sus vidas, en sus profesiones, pero también en la experiencia colegial, donde van a entrar y con el favor de Dios salir. Porque los que varias veces miro que entran simplemente tratando de llegar a una profesión donde no les gusta, se encuentran con unas barreras grandísimas y simplemente algunos ni salen de la universidad. Y eso es lo que no queremos para ustedes. Queremos que sigan, que lleguen y que sigan adelante y que se utilen en lo que ustedes quieran hacer. Hay un estudio que también se realizó hace poco que dice que el 85% de las empresas o los labores que van a existir para el año 2030 todavía no existen. Por eso les digo a los estudiantes y a los padres que por favor no miren hacia atrás cuando están buscando su futuro, sino busquen las oportunidades que les van a brindar, las oportunidades que ustedes puedan crear su propio futuro. Sigan lo que más les apasione, no lo que les va a dar el dinero ahorita. el dinero viene si de veras hacen lo que de veras quieren hacer.
También hay gente ahí que piensan que estudiantes indocumentadas no pueden ir a la universidad. ¿Qué piensas de eso?
Es un tema muy difícil. Es un tema que, especialmente ahorita a nivel político, es muy, digamos, tabú, donde no se debemos de hablar tanto de esto. Pero lo que les digo a mis padres y a mis estudiantes que se encuentren en estas posiciones, que no se dejen intimidar por lo que está pasando. Sin embargo, que si de veras quieren acceder a sus sueños, que le echen ganas y sigan adelante. Cuando yo empecé mi carrera, el tema de estudiantes indocumentados apenas estaba llegando a los temas de las universidades. Y en esto hice mi maestría y quiero que también sepan que hay accesos, oportunidades y programas que les van a poder y dar información cómo seguir adelante. Por ejemplo, immigrantsrising.org es una organización aquí en el área de la Bahía. Otra que se llama scholarshipsaz.org es una organización que yo, gracias a Dios, pude fundar. Y analizamos estas oportunidades y accesos a las universidades. Porque para nosotros lo más importante es de que el sueño no tenga limitaciones. Pero si ustedes sueñan con las oportunidades de seguir adelante, las puertas van a estar abiertas. Claro, no es el mismo camino que todos los estudiantes, pero si de veras quiere, las oportunidades van a estar. So, sigan adelante y no se dejen con el temor de que no van a poder seguir. Sin embargo, hagan las preguntas, hablen con las personas y busquen esas oportunidades.
Además, tenemos bastantes recursos en nuestro website, collegesaguide.com. Tenemos recursos concretos para estudiantes indocumentadas y hay otros episodios de este podcast que hablamos de las cosas que sí pueden hacer. Estamos aquí para apoyar. Una pregunta que tenía mi familia es la preocupación sobre el dinero. ¿Qué les dice a los padres que se preocupan de no tener suficiente dinero para pagar la universidad?
El estudio, el acceso es muy cariñoso, como decimos. Pero sin embargo, yo siempre les digo a mis comunidades, especialmente a la comunidad latina, que existen realidades y cosas culturales que podemos utilizar para que este miedo se nos quite. Lo que sí miro siempre es de que se nos hace muy fácil un fin de semana ir, digamos, cualquier lugar y sacar, no sé, la troca o el carro de nuestros sueños y firmámoslo luego para sacar $60,000-$80,000 de deuda. Sin embargo, cuando hablamos de sacar esa cantidad para la educación, pues nos da un poquito más de miedo. Otra de las cosas que les he dicho a mi comunidad, que me da mucho orgullo que tenemos esta tradición, que es la quinceañera. Es la tradición donde podemos honrar nuestras hijas y que sigan adelante, pero es algo que es una buena inversión. Y muchas veces me dicen los padres, pues nos gustaría que nos hicieras el honor de asistir. Y luego ya cuando van a tener 14 años me dicen, pues, ¿sabes qué? Últimamente estamos pensando y no lo vamos a hacer. Mejor le vamos a comprar el carro o el viaje de sus sueños, etcétera, etcétera. Pero como 2 o 3 semanas o 2 o 3 meses antes de la quinceañera me llega la invitación. Y me pregunto, ¿cómo lo hicimos? Y me pongo a pensar y hemos analizado que pues la manera en que lo hemos hecho tradicionalmente es pedir esta cosa que se llama madrinas y padrinos, que es algo muy bonito y muy algo que nuestra comunidad les encanta hacer. ¿Por qué no tomamos esa misma mentalidad e invertimos simplemente en esa misma manera a la área de nuestros estudios? ¿Por qué no buscar madrina o padrino para el depósito de la universidad? ¿Por qué no buscar madrina o padrino para los libros del primer año de nuestra universidad? ¿O por qué no decirles, mira, patrocíname para una beca por 1 año, o 2 años, o 3 años, o 4 años para mi educación? Imagínense lo que podríamos hacer. Vamos a invertir en el futuro de nuestros hijos y sigamos adelante.
Recientemente, la Corte Suprema ha dicho que la raza ya no se puede considerar en la admisión. ¿Significa esto que los estudiantes no deben hablar sobre su raza o origen étnico? ¿Qué piensas?
Muy buena pregunta para lo que está ocurriendo ahorita en este momento. Gracias por preguntarme. Para mis estudiantes y para mis padres que están escuchando ahorita, no dejen que lo que ha pasado ahorita los limite en hablar sobre sus propias experiencias. Lo que ha dicho la Corte Suprema es de que sí, no quieren que las universidades utilicen lo que se antes marcar una casilla de su identidad y que eso se fuera a considerar simplemente en su selección para la universidad. Pero lo que la Corte Suprema no entiende, porque no están en esta profesión, es de que el estudiante se recluta por todas las cualidades que llega y atrae a la mesa cuando estamos buscando estudiantes para la clase entrante. Estudiantes, no dejen de limitarse. Ustedes pueden hablar de sus propias experiencias, pero ahora lo que no van a ver es un lugar donde van a poder ustedes marcar simplemente de dónde vienen. Pero si es algo importante de sus propias experiencias, es muy importante que ustedes, por favor, nos expliquen cómo fue que tu raza o tu identidad jugó parte de la realidad a la cual vas a traer a nuestras universidades.
¿Qué mensaje tienes para los consejeros en este momento?
Ahorita también para mis consejeros y para las comunidades, ahorita es buen tiempo para que ustedes también empecemos a formar convenios y que estemos hablando de cómo podemos apoyar a nuestras comunidades para que no simplemente estén llegando, sino que también estén completando la carrera educacional.
¿Qué mensaje quieres dejar con los estudiantes y familias que están escuchando?
Para mis padres, una de las cosas que a muchos se les olvida es de que ustedes no son los únicos que están tratando de navegar esta oportunidad. Si se les hace difícil o si es algo que les da un poquito de temor, busquen las otras familias que están navegando estas mismas oportunidades en su distrito, en su escuela o en el condado y viajen juntos a las universidades. Vengan, hagan las preguntas juntos. Y acuérdense, estudiantes, que ustedes son los que van a acceder a estas universidades. Quiero que ustedes tomen las riendas y que ustedes sean los que están haciendo las preguntas, no sus padres. Esta experiencia sea algo maravilloso, que tomen tiempo de celebrar que están a esta etapa de su experiencia, que no están solos, que por favor se comuniquen con cualquier otra persona y que se comuniquen con nosotros si necesitan un poquito más de ayuda, porque las más preguntas que tengan ustedes, el mejor empleo que voy a tener yo. Por favor, sigan utilizándonos y déjenos saber cómo les podemos servir a ustedes.
Lorenzo, muchísimas gracias por su tiempo.
Gracias por la invitación. Es un honor estar aquí con ustedes.
Hi, friends. So this is the transition from the Spanish to the English section. And if you're not bilingual, just know that we mostly kept the content the same. My guest is Lorenzo Gamboa, the Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach at Santa Clara. Lorenzo is originally from a very small town with just 8 graduating seniors in his public high school class. He's familiar with the assumptions and fears that one may have when considering leaving town for college, and he aspires to clarify the daunting experience for other first-gen students that he once faced himself. He holds a BS in economics from Santa Clara University, an MA in Mexican-American Studies with a concentration in immigration and higher education from the University of Arizona, an MBA from Santa Clara, and he's currently working on his EDD, also at Santa Clara. Lorenzo, hi. Welcome to the podcast.
It's an honor to be here, man.
I'm so glad to connect with you in this way. We've been talking about this for a long time. One of the things that I don't think I know about from you is how you even got into admissions in the first place.
Great question, man. It's one of those life adventures that you just don't even know, exists, let alone that it could be a profession. I actually ended up as a first generation student, going in through the path of education and going straight into the workforce right away because that's what I thought college was about. So I ended up in international sales actually for my first career, traveled internationally quite a bit, and then came back, was an engineer in Silicon Valley doing takeoff engineering. But then having graduated from a Jesuit institution, I was invited to come back and talk about the ethical conflict of your profession and your personal values. And on that panel, one of the questions was like, how do you feel when you go home? And having grown up in Colorado on a ranch in Mother Nature, all that stuff, it was just like, a ton of bricks hitting me. And so came back and reflected, and I was like, wow, you know what? Like, yes, I'm a great engineer and I can do great takeoff and do all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm ruining Mother Nature. And I could be the best engineer in the world, but I would never be able to bring her back. And so somebody in the panel was like, wow, have you ever thought about the world of admission? Like, we're hiring. And I said, what is admission? And they said, well, you basically get to talk about the stuff that you just did now and try to convince students about higher education. And they said you could use all your skills like engineering and business and what you do and for the betterment of society. And I was like, okay, let's try it. I thought I was going to do it for, a couple months, and lo and behold, a couple months has now turned into close to 2 decades.
Wow. I love hearing that. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, in terms of your relationship with your family and education, what were the messages that you received growing up?
First generation kid, it probably is like, the similar story of you need to try hard. Like, I don't want you to live the experience that you're having to see us go through. We've worked hard to give you what you have and have access to. Take advantage of every opportunity. Like, those were the pillars of, I think, every first generation family who says, like, we're investing in you, so please take advantage of it.
I'd love to hear a little bit about, what do you spend most of your time doing at work? In other words, what problems are you working to solve in your office?
What problems am I trying to solve? I think the biggest thing that I work on every day is, per my title, diversity, inclusion, and outreach. I think my role in that is to pull back the veil of higher education so that regardless of who you are, low income, high income, but even right now, middle income families who fear that access to education is becoming harder and harder for them. So for me, I work with all demographics, with all socioeconomic statuses, with all realities of higher education, and say, hey, here's what's going on, but also how do we take the experiences of what we've learned to promote access to the future? And what does that future look like?
One of the things we talked about when we met, my gosh, it's been, I don't know, like 2 years now, but we talked about speaking directly to Latinx families and busting some of the myths, as it were, that are out there. So I'd love to take some time and just go through some of these. What are some of the myths that you feel like Latinx families run up against that can sometimes create barriers to higher education?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is many assume and are afraid that they're just not going to get into college, that they don't have the right grades or the qualifications to get into an institution where they can make progress, right? And so one of the things that I really like to spread, especially with my experience now, is to tell them, like, no, in fact, there are currently more seats available in colleges across the country than there are actually students ready to apply for them right now. The real fact that many students don't realize is that college acceptance rates across the country actually hover around 70%. So it is really in their favor to get into college versus getting out of the pool. And that's proven by research.com. Another thing is that, there are well over half of the colleges in the country that actually admit more people that apply to them than they have to deny. So there is no real reason to believe that you can't get into college. In fact, community colleges, many students don't realize this, but they don't turn away anybody. They don't deny anyone to get into that pipeline of higher education. So if you want to go to college, there is a way for everyone.
Yeah, I think oftentimes students and parents are focused on those highly selective schools, right? The ones that are in the rankings or in the news, and they forget, or they don't know that there are so many colleges out there, in some cases relatively nearby, right, that are willing to take them.
And I think, they don't realize that there's over 4,000 colleges and universities in the country. And so we're all looking for very different and distinct things. Obviously, if you're only going to be pecking for the ones you hear on the news, well, yeah, it's going to be extremely selective. But open up your mind, the opportunity and access, and there's many wonderful, wonderful institutions to consider.
Let's talk about money for a minute. A lot of folks feel like private schools are much more expensive than public schools. What do you say to those folks?
The reality is higher education in general is just crazy expensive now. However, what they got to keep in mind is that there are avenues and ways of getting money. Keep in mind that private universities actually generate their own revenue. And so I tell them, think about us as kind of a business, because I am of the private sector. So what we're looking for is students who really show us that they're the wise investment for the institution. So if you go to school, you do what you're supposed to, we will invest in you. And a private university that sometimes seems way out of reach can actually become something more affordable and sometimes even cheaper than some of the public options that some students have based off of their student profiles. So I always tell them, some privates, yeah, they can cover up to expected family need and even beyond that. But again, it comes down to what you have to put at the table. You do the work, you do what's needed, we will invest in you. You do the minimum amount of work, well, then you invest in us. Plain and simple.
I don't know if you know this about me, Lorenzo, but I worked part-time, sort of on a volunteer basis at a charter school in Los Angeles here. And most of my students were first gen. Many of them, their families were low income. A big thing that came up was families worrying that, when their kid goes away, they're going to lose touch with them. And this was something that I grew up with. I think you know this, I grew up overseas in Latin America and then in Miami. And it was constantly like, no me vas a dejar, like, right, don't leave me. What do you say to those families who have that fear that their kid is going to leave them or they're going to lose touch with them?
I think that's a really great concern for a lot of families. And it just speaks volumes about like how important family values are to them. But what I do tell them is that think about in today's society, who really loses touch? Everyone really has access to cell phones, FaceTime, Zoom, all these other platforms that today facilitate contact if that's what they're looking for. In fact, I always challenge them to try to tell me if they could find somebody in college who today doesn't have access to a cell phone, a tablet, or a computer, or something that they really can't get access to. The Pew Research Center found that 97% of college students in 2021 had access to a cell phone, let alone speed up to today, pretty much 100% of our students have access to it. Will they be at every family gathering? Probably not, but that's college, right? And that's the experience, and so that's the value of getting out there. Will they lose who they are? It comes down to their personal family values and culture and core values. But connecting family, that I don't think will be ever an issue moving forward. Now, you have a desire to get contact, you'll be able to make it.
Another thing that I've heard students struggle with and think about is their college major. What am I going to study? Some students worry, of course, if I don't figure out what I'm going to study, then I'm not going to get in. Or, if I don't have, parents sometimes worry, if you don't major in one of these, 3 to 5 careers, you're not going to get a good paying job. What do you say to parents when it comes to advising students on thinking about their major?
So especially in our Latino community, because as a Latino, you always think of the top, right? The engineers, the lawyers, the teachers, the doctors, but we forget about all these other professions and opportunities to find. What I tell my students and my families is what you need to do is to actually major in something that gives you passion. That way you don't start college and start with a sour taste of it and then drop out. I want you to focus on something that you really, really want to do, because what matters most about college is that you actually go in and get a degree and you come out with a degree. Money is always going to come out of something that you're most passionate about. When people find that your passion aligns with what you're doing, they're going to follow you regardless of what that is. So majoring for pay, that only brings frustration and this feeling of not actually being fulfilled at the end of the day. And that's why people feel frustrated with life in general. In fact, experts always say that right now, 85% of the jobs currently are still even being invented for the year of 2030. So find what you're passionate about and make your passion fit into the future that you're looking for. not make what is currently part of success fit into what your future is going to look like.
Yeah, for those who are listening and interested in this topic, we have a different podcast with Laura Young from UCLA who talks about the myth of the starving artist. So this idea that, for example, if you go into a creative field, that you're not going to make money. And she debunks that with a lot of research and beautiful arguments. So if folks are interested in that, you can check that out. We'll have that in the show notes.
Definitely encourage you guys to check it out, because even in Silicon Valley, where we're located, the arts are big and thriving. We encourage all of our students, regardless of where you're at, to get involved in the arts.
The first episode that we ever did on this podcast, Lorenzo, I did it with an undocumented student. And then the part 2 was with Elisa Gilbert, who works with undocumented students. And if folks are interested in learning more and you haven't heard those episodes, I encourage you to go back and check those out. But what do you say to families who are worried that, as an undocumented student, they're not going to be able to get into college, they're not going to be able to get financial aid, those kinds of things? What do you say to those families?
Those are major and real concerns. And in fact, this is one of the topics that actually kept me in higher education. Because when I was starting, undocumented students were barely hitting the sound waves of higher education. And so that motivated me to continue, get involved in it. I come from a mixed status family household. I know what the realities of this looks like. I've been heavily invested in this. My graduate degree is actually in undocumented students in higher ed. Helped found an organization called Scholarships AZ that helps promote access to education. Been involved with Educators for Fair Consideration, which is now immigrantsrising.org. We promote heavily that education should be accessible to anybody, regardless of where you're at in the world. However, their realities is, it's challenging. However, again, regardless of citizenship, there should be access to opportunity to your education if that's what you desire. Current politics of the country can make it a little more difficult for some people, but I always tell them, again, look for the organizations and people who are willing to help and help you navigate this hard landscape. Never give up on any dream, especially if the dream is education, because also understand that undocumented students may need to work a little bit harder than the average student, especially as they're trying to open more doors. But again, keep asking questions, demonstrate that you really want it, and the opportunity will come.
2 more resources that I want to ping for you. Number 1, we have a resource that's called 15 Ways to Support Undocumented Students. We'll put it in the show notes. And that resource is for counselors who are interested to know more about this, but also for students. And then students listening, I want to encourage you to talk to your college counselor, or if there are organizations that are partnering with your school, for example, CBOs, sometimes they've got counselors who are really well-versed in helping undocumented students apply to college. What about money? Let's talk a little bit more about getting funds to pay for education. What do you say to families who think of that as the barrier and they think, I'm not going to have enough money to pay for my kid's education?
This is a fear that everyone has, so you're not alone in feeling this. Hundreds of families live with the same fear. However, we have a community. And I think in the Latino community, there's a beautiful thing that I love to reference, and that's this culture and idea we call la quinceañera. Again, a rite of passage for our young ladies as they become adults. And it's a fairly big investment. And what's really interesting is that oftentimes, we get to meet a ton of people and a lot of families, and they all, want to invite us to these beautiful quinceañera celebrations, which is basically a major investment, just kind of similar to a wedding. And then year 13, year 14 comes around and they're like, well, we're not going to make the quinceañera because it's so expensive. Instead, we're going to buy her the car of her dreams or vacation of her dreams, et cetera, et cetera. Well, lo and behold, 3 months before her birthday, quinceañera comes around, I get a invitation. And I ask myself, how did we do this? Well, in the Latino culture, we have this idea of madrinas and padrinos, supporters, sponsors, right? And we ask them to sponsor part of that festivity. Well, why don't we take that same model, that same idea, that same cultural pride, and ask for madrinas and padrinos for the enrollment deposit of my university experience, the first year of college books for my college experience, or that scholarship, whether it be $500 or $1,000 or $2,000, whatever they can do and ask for them to invest in your future. If we take that model, imagine what we could do as a culture, as a community, in promoting access to education.
One of the things that happened somewhat recently is the Supreme Court said that race can no longer be considered as a single factor in admission, and that students won't get a preference based on race. Does this mean that students should not talk about race or ethnicity in their applications?
Ethan, for bringing that up. I think this is one of the scariest moments of higher education that really is pushing students to think whether or not they should talk about it. And I would say not at all. The Supreme Court, or what we call SCOTUS, did rule on the fact that what they called check the box was an illegal practice in consideration in reviewing applications. However, what they did fail to really understand is that the world of admissions is well beyond just simply checking a box. Like, we recruit students for who you are throughout the high school experience, and not just because of what you checked off. Many other factors do go into this, so I encourage you to please do not be intimidated by this ruling. Please, please, please put down anything that you wish to discuss in your application. Your personal essay does not have to be about your race or ethnicity if that's not what you wish, but there should be something in the application, whether it be a supplemental section where you can mention it if that's what you wish to do. Again, you will not be admitted simply based off of a race or ethnicity factor. It is because of everything you're bringing to the table.
So I want to go a little deeper here. One of the things that the decision said is that even though, the court reiterated its opinion that the outright consideration of race as a standalone factor violates the 14th Amendment, but then they say, at the same time, and I'm quoting here, nothing prohibits universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected the applicant's life, so long as that discussion is concretely tied to a quality of character or unique ability that the particular applicant can contribute to the university, end quote. So I'm curious, can you think of any examples of times when students have talked about race when they've connected it to a quality of character or unique ability? Or for students who are considering this and trying to figure out what this means, like what are some even hypothetical examples of what that could look like in the application?
Plain and simple, you all can think of, depending on where you're at, what city, what state, what town, there's a good side and the bad side of town, right? We're not all cut equally. We don't all have the same exact resources. So depending on where you're at, you might be able to enjoy the Whole Foods, the Starbucks, the low crime rates. Depending on the other side, you're going to be walking across, pawn shops and liquor stores and fearing for, just having access to education. All of those things are factors that build into character that you all get to write about. So don't ever feel intimidated to tell us where you're coming from, what you're doing, and how that brings joy to who you are. We mentioned earlier in the podcast about the quinceañera. That's a cultural experience that nobody can take away from you. So feel free to speak about it.
One thing I want to note for listeners as well, if this is something that you're considering or something that you're thinking through for students, we're going to link in the show notes to a guide. If you're thinking about writing about cultural influences in your application, we've created a resource that gives a lot of examples. You can look at how other students have done this. And like Lorenzo is saying here, you don't necessarily have to write about race, obviously, but if it has had an impact and you can concretely tie it to a quality of character or unique ability, then it could be worth mentioning. It sounds like colleges care. And Lorenzo, in your conversations with other colleges, what is your sense of, how the college admissions field is responding to the Supreme Court decision, just based on conversations that you've had with other admission officers?
This has given us a call of action to unite and to, again, empower the students to realize you really own your application. You have the ability to disclose what you wish. Yes, we are limited on now what SCOTUS or the Supreme Court has told us, but at the end of the day, we're not going to stop doing what we do, which is to try to educate the country's brightest individuals to take on the challenges of the future. And that future needs to reflect what our communities are becoming. And that is a multidisciplinary, multi-ethnic, multi-educated society. And so we want to bring you guys all to say, here we are. and we're ready to take on the future.
Let's talk to counselors, college counselors, and folks who are working in CBOs. What message do you have for them right now?
Counselors and CBOs, I would say this is the perfect time to begin establishing an alignment to your mission and your goals, and make sure that you find concrete partnerships to develop pipelines. Like, we're all in the same game together. We want to promote access and opportunities. Now let's start building those building blocks together so we can expand that pipeline and make sure that our students are getting to college, but also getting through college, which is more important.
Oh man, that's a whole separate podcast. I want to do that one with you next. What message would you like to leave families with, parents and students?
That this is the most exciting part of your life, parents and students. You get to reimagine and redefine, but also be the pillars of what the future is going to become. So please, hopefully this becomes an enjoyable experience for each and every one of you. Open your minds and the opportunities for what you have access to, and don't be afraid to reach out to ask questions, because the more questions you have, the more job security we have.
Love that.
One of the things that many families don't realize is that you're not the only one on this adventure, right? So if this is something that is intimidating for you, connect with families that you already know in your school district, in your local community, and navigate this together. Like, there's oftentimes comfort when you're in a group versus trying to do it by your own, right? So I encourage you, go visit together, go ask questions together. But at the end of the day, remember, it is you, student, who is trying to get access to the next opportunity. So you should be asking the questions, not your parents.
What would you say to families, in particular students who are nervous about reaching out to college admission officers?
Don't be nervous. Like, we admission officers had to go through the same stages you did. So just open up with that. How can I become you? How can I access your college? What are you simply looking for? If they are honest and authentic admission officers, they're going to really be there for you every step of the way. Like, we're very blessed at Santa Clara. I get to be an admission officer for the access of higher education, not just Santa Clara University. So we, yes, have the myth of becoming gatekeepers, but the reality is that we are also the people that can help you get to those gates too.
Lorenzo, thank you so much. Hi friends, thanks again for listening. You'll find everything you need in the show notes, all the links to the resources at collegeessayguide.com/podcast. If you're not on our email list, we'd love to have you. We share lots of free webinars and resources pretty much on a monthly basis, but sometimes even more often than that. You can sign up at collegeessayguide.com. Be well and stay curious. Gracias compañeros otra vez por estar aquí con nosotros en este tiempo. Tenemos muchísimos recursos en collegeessayguide.com/podcast. Y bueno, hablamos pronto.